It was a cool autumn evening when Jason sat in the dimly lit living room of his home. The golden leaves fluttered outside, and there was an unsettling silence inside. The house was quiet in a way that made Jason uneasy. He glanced at the photos of his wife, Emily, and their young daughter, and a sudden heaviness washed over him. Jason had always prided himself on being a responsible man, a hard worker, a dependable husband. But tonight, something inside him shifted. He didn't want to be in this life anymore. Emily had always been the loving, dedicated wife, the kind of person who supported him no matter what. She would always tell him how proud she was of him, how happy she was with their life together. But somewhere along the way, Jason began to feel trapped. There was a pressure in his chest that he couldn't explain, a deep ache that he thought would go away if he just kept pushing through. But it didn't. Every day, he felt more distant from his family, like a stranger in his own home. The conversations with Emily had become routine, and the love he once felt had faded into something unrecognizable. It wasn't that he didn't care about Emily or their daughter, Lily. He loved them. He really did. But the weight of their expectations, the daily responsibilities, and the lack of excitement in his life made him feel suffocated. He told himself that he deserved more. He deserved to be free, to do what he wanted, to live a life without the constant pull of obligations. That night, after a quiet dinner with Emily, Jason stood up, walked to the door, and without a word, left. He didn't even look back. The decision was sudden, yet he felt a strange sense of relief. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he was certain that staying with Emily and Lily was not it. The guilt didn't hit him immediately. It was like his mind had shut off, allowing him to escape without facing the emotions that would soon follow. He didn't think about how Emily would react or how his daughter would feel. Emily was stunned when Jason didn't return that night. She waited, thinking he might be out late with friends, but as the days passed, doubt crept in. When Jason's phone calls went unanswered and he failed to show up at their usual spots, she realized something was terribly wrong. The truth came crashing down. Jason had left her. At first, Emily didn't know how to feel. Hurt, confused, angry. All of these emotions swirled inside her, but there was a deep, gnawing sadness that overtook everything else. She couldn't understand why Jason would leave her after everything they had been through. What had gone wrong? She racked her brain, wondering if she had done something wrong. Had she been a bad wife? Had she missed the signs? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there had been no warning. Just a sudden, heartbreaking departure. She was left to pick up the pieces, trying to find a way to carry on for Lily's sake. Raising their daughter alone wasn't easy, but Emily was determined to stay strong. Every day felt like a battle, but she never gave up. She focused on Lily, who was too young to understand the complexities of what had just happened, and did everything she could to make their life as normal as possible. Emily found herself fighting through waves of loneliness, but she knew she had to keep going. There was no other choice. Meanwhile, Jason didn't look back. His life, as he had hoped, felt like a fresh start. He tried to forget the life he left behind and threw himself into new adventures, new relationships. But even as he began his new chapter, something inside him remained empty. He couldn't explain it. Despite the freedom he had longed for, he felt a deep hole that no new experiences could fill. The past wasn't so easily erased, and though Jason had walked away, it seemed like life had a way of making sure he would never fully forget the choices he made. After Jason left, life for Emily became a blur of routine and heartache. The first few days were the hardest. She couldn't stop replaying the moment he walked out, asking herself over and over again what she had missed. She had always thought that their love was strong, that nothing could tear them apart. But now, as she sat alone in their once happy home, the silence screamed louder than anything else. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, felt cold and empty. Every room reminded her of what they had lost. Emily spent the first few weeks staring out the window, hoping for a sign that Jason would come back, that he would walk through the door and explain himself. But the days turned into weeks, and still, there was no word from him. She tried to reach out, but her calls and messages went unanswered. The feeling of abandonment crept into her bones, and she felt it in every corner of her life. Emily found herself constantly worrying about their daughter, Lily. At only 4 years old, Lily had no idea what was going on. She still asked for her daddy, still wondered when he would come home. It broke Emily's heart to see the confusion in Lily's eyes, to hear the little voice asking, "Where's Daddy?" every single day. Emily could only offer soft reassurances, telling her that Daddy was just away for a little while. But deep down, she knew that the truth was more complicated than that. As the days passed, Emily forced herself to push through the pain. She knew that she couldn't fall apart. She had to be strong for Lily. She began to focus more on her work, throwing herself into her job as a teacher. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it helped keep her mind busy. At night, when Lily was asleep, Emily allowed herself to cry. Sometimes she would curl up on the couch, clutching her pillow, and let the tears flow freely. It was the only way she could release the pressure building inside her. Months went by, and Emily started to adjust to life without Jason. She became more independent, learning to manage everything on her own. She took care of Lily, paid the bills, and fixed things around the house that Jason would have done. Every day, she found small victories, whether it was making a successful dinner or just managing to get through the day without feeling completely overwhelmed. Slowly, she began to regain her confidence. But even as she adjusted, there was always a part of her that wondered about Jason. She didn't want to think about him, but every now and then, his absence would hit her like a wave, pulling her back into that painful moment when he had walked out. What had happened to the man she had loved so deeply? Where had he gone? Had he forgotten about them completely? And why had he left in the first place? Meanwhile, Jason had settled into a new life. He had moved to a different city, far away from the life he had known. He tried to keep busy, surrounding himself with new people, new experiences, but even with all the distractions, something always felt missing. He tried to fill the emptiness with relationships, but none of them were the same. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that leaving was the right thing to do, the guilt never really left him. Occasionally, Jason would think about Emily and Lily, wondering how they were doing. But it wasn't the guilt that drove him to check in. It was more like an unsettling curiosity. He had walked away, and now there was a part of him that felt disconnected from everything he had left behind. The pain of his decision was starting to sink in, and it became harder to ignore. But instead of reaching out to fix things, Jason buried the feelings, convincing himself that it was too late. Neither Emily nor Jason had any idea that their paths would cross again, that the choices they made years ago would come rushing back to them in a way they never saw coming. But for now, they were living separate lives, each carrying the weight of the past differently. Emily was learning to find strength in herself, while Jason was trying to escape the echoes of his own decisions. Over the years, Jason tried to move on from his past, convincing himself that he was doing the right thing by starting fresh. He found himself in a new city, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and new experiences. At first, it felt like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He was no longer bound by the expectations and responsibilities that had weighed him down before. The freedom was exhilarating, and for a time, he thought he could bury his past completely. But as the months passed, Jason began to realize that no matter how far he ran, his past was always there, lurking in the background. He had tried to fill the void with different people and activities, but none of them could shake the nagging feeling that something was missing. The relationships he tried to build never felt as real as the one he had with Emily. He began to notice how easily he could connect with others on a surface level, but there was always a wall between him and the people around him. They didn't know the real Jason, the one who had once been a husband, a father. He found himself occasionally thinking about Emily and Lily, though he quickly pushed the thoughts away. He hadn't reached out to them, and in his mind, it was too late to fix things. He convinced himself that they had moved on without him, and he didn't want to disrupt the lives they had now built. But every so often, he would catch himself wondering what Emily was doing, how Lily had grown up, and whether they had managed to find happiness without him. In the meantime, Emily had made a life for herself and Lily. The pain of Jason's departure never fully went away, but over time, it became something she had learned to live with. She had found a rhythm in her daily life, managing to balance her work as a teacher and raising Lily on her own. She didn't have much time for herself, but she was content in the way she had been able to rebuild her life. Though the loneliness still lingered, Emily was proud of how far she had come. She had learned to depend on herself, finding strength in the small victories. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, especially when Lily asked about her father, but she kept pushing forward. Emily knew that she had done her best to provide Lily with love and stability. Then, unexpectedly, something happened that would change everything. It wasn't a dramatic event or a momentous occasion, but rather a chance encounter that would alter the course of Jason and Emily's lives forever. One afternoon, Jason found himself visiting a local coffee shop, his usual place of escape from the chaos of his thoughts. As he waited for his drink, he caught a glimpse of someone across the room. His heart skipped a beat. There, sitting quietly at a table near the window, was Emily. It had been years since he had seen her, and she looked different, older, but still unmistakably the woman he had once loved. For a moment, Jason hesitated. He hadn't expected to run into her like this, not after everything that had happened. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His mind raced, wondering if she had seen him yet. He thought about turning around and walking out, but something inside him made him stay. Emily, on the other hand, had no idea Jason was there. She was busy with her phone, scrolling through some messages, lost in her own world. When she finally looked up, her eyes met Jason's across the room. The briefest of pauses followed, and then it all hit her, the rush of memories, the mix of emotions she had spent years burying. Jason, the man who had once been her everything, now standing before her as a stranger. Jason saw the recognition in Emily's eyes, but there was no anger, no bitterness. Instead, there was a sadness, an understanding of what had been lost. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him, and for the first time in years, he wondered if he could somehow make things right. Emily didn't immediately rush over to him. She stayed where she was, her heart racing. She wasn't sure what to say, how to react. It had been so long, and yet here he was. In that brief moment, she couldn't decide if she wanted to scream at him for abandoning her, or hug him and ask why he had left. But she did neither. Instead, she simply looked at him and waited for him to make the first move. Jason stood across the room, still uncertain about whether he should approach Emily. The recognition in her eyes was clear, but there was no immediate rush of emotions like he had expected. Instead, there was a strange calmness between them, as if the years that had passed since their separation had created a silent understanding. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Jason felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. So many questions swirled in his mind. Should he apologize? Should he explain why he left, even though he didn't have a clear reason at the time? Would Emily even want to hear it? He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. It had been too long, and the gap between them felt too wide to cross with a simple conversation. Emily looked at Jason, her heart beating faster than she would have liked. She had spent so many years pushing the pain of his departure deep inside, convincing herself that she was better off without him. But now, seeing him standing there, it was as if all those emotions she had tried to forget came rushing back to the surface. She wanted to shout at him, ask him why he had left them, why he had torn apart their family. But there was something else, something unexpected, curiosity. She found herself wondering what he had been doing all these years, what his life had become after abandoning them. After what felt like an eternity, Emily broke the silence. She gave him a brief nod, acknowledging his presence, but didn't speak at first. Jason, sensing the awkwardness, took a hesitant step forward. "Emily," he said, his voice sounding uncertain, as if he wasn't sure what to say or how to begin. Emily didn't respond immediately, instead focusing on the cup of coffee in her hands. She didn't know what kind of reaction she was expecting from herself, but it definitely wasn't this strange, almost detached feeling. She had imagined so many scenarios where they would meet again, where she would finally get the closure she had been denied. But this wasn't what she had envisioned. "Emily, I'm sorry," Jason began, his words coming out quietly. He could see the pain in her eyes, and it made his chest tighten. "I know I've made mistakes, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know where to start." His voice trailed off, and he looked down at the table, feeling more helpless than he ever had before. Emily felt a mixture of emotions wash over her. She had heard apologies before, but none of them had ever felt real, especially not the ones from Jason all those years ago. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear this apology, but part of her needed to know that he understood the weight of what he had done. "Do you know how hard it was?" Emily asked, her voice low but steady. She didn't want to shout, didn't want to break down in front of him, but the words had to be said. "Do you know how many nights I stayed awake, wondering why you just left? I had no answers. I had no closure. And I had to raise Lily on my own, with no one to help. I don't think you'll ever understand what that was like." Jason flinched at her words. He had thought about what it might have been like for her, but hearing it from her directly made the reality of his actions hit him harder than he had anticipated. He had been selfish, running away from his problems instead of facing them. And now, years later, the consequences of his choices were clear. "I know," Jason said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm so sorry, Emily. I wish I could have been there. I wish I hadn't left. But I know that words aren't enough. I can't change what I did." Emily nodded, still holding her coffee cup, but her mind was racing. This wasn't easy. No part of it was. But as she looked at Jason, she realized that things could never go back to the way they were. He couldn't just walk back into her life like nothing had happened. The years of heartache, of building a new life without him, couldn't be erased with a few words. But there was something else, something unexpected that tugged at her heart. Despite everything, despite the pain he had caused, she could still see the man she had once loved in the way Jason held himself. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but he was here now, trying to make things right, even if it was too late. As they sat there in silence for a few more moments, neither of them knowing where to go from here, Jason noticed something that caught his attention, a subtle shift in Emily's demeanor. She wasn't angry, but there was a quiet strength in her that he hadn't seen before. It was a strength born from years of surviving on her own, of raising Lily without him, of finding the courage to move on. For the first time in years, Jason realized that Emily had become someone he could admire. She had grown in ways he hadn't expected, and the realization hit him harder than anything else. "Emily, is Lily?" Jason started, but Emily interrupted him. The days after their unexpected encounter were strange for both Jason and Emily. There was an unspoken tension that hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. Neither of them knew exactly what to do next. Jason felt a mix of regret and hope that maybe, just maybe, he could somehow make amends for the years he had lost. But how? How could he fix something that had been broken for so long? Emily, on the other hand, was torn between the anger she had buried deep inside and the curiosity about what Jason had become. She hadn't expected him to show up like this, not after everything that had happened. But here he was, standing before her, apologizing for the past. Part of her wanted to hate him for leaving, for abandoning their family when they needed him most. But there was another part of her, one that had been buried under years of pain, that still cared for the man she had once loved. Days passed, and neither Jason nor Emily reached out to each other. Jason's mind raced with thoughts of how to reconnect with her and, more importantly, with Lily. He knew it wasn't going to be easy. After all, Lily was no longer the little girl he had left behind. She was a young girl now, with her own life, her own thoughts. Would she even want to meet him? Could he make up for the time he had missed? These questions gnawed at him, but the answers seemed just out of reach. It wasn't until Jason received a phone call from an unexpected source that everything started to shift. It was Emily. Her voice sounded calm, but there was a hint of something else, something that Jason couldn't quite place. Jason. Emily's voice came through the phone, sounding steady but unsure. I've been thinking. I think it's time you met Lily. She's been asking about you more and more lately. I think she's old enough to understand now, to hear the truth. Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected Emily to invite him into Lily's life again, let alone give him a chance to meet her. But the offer was there, hanging in the air, and Jason knew that this was his chance. It was now or never. He agreed to meet her, and they set a date. Jason spent the next few days preparing himself, his thoughts consumed with anxiety. What would he say to Lily? How could he explain himself after all this time? He practiced what he would say in the mirror, trying to find the right words, but nothing seemed good enough. He was terrified that Lily would reject him, that she would see him as a stranger, and not the father he had hoped to be. The day of the meeting arrived, and Jason was a bundle of nerves. He arrived early, waiting outside Emily's house, trying to calm his racing thoughts. When Emily finally opened the door, she gave him a small, tight-lipped smile before stepping aside to let him in. Lily was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her back turned to the door. She was no longer the little girl he remembered. She had grown up. As Jason stepped into the room, Emily spoke softly. "Lily, there's someone here I'd like you to meet." Lily turned around, her eyes locking with Jason's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lily's gaze was cautious, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of recognition, maybe curiosity, maybe something more. "Hi," Jason said softly, his voice trembling. I'm your dad." Lily didn't immediately respond. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Jason felt the weight of her gaze, and he could tell that she was processing what he had just said. This was it, the moment of truth. He had no idea what she would do, but he knew that he couldn't undo the years he had lost. All he could do was be honest, be there for her now. After what seemed like an eternity, Lily finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Why did you leave?" she asked, her words cutting through the silence like a knife. Jason swallowed hard, feeling the full weight of her question. It was the question he had been avoiding, the one he had never really answered. He looked at her, his heart aching, and said, "I was wrong to leave. I didn't know how to handle everything, and I thought running away was the answer. But I see now that I made a huge mistake, and I'm sorry." Lily didn't say anything more. She just looked at him, her face still serious, but not as cold as before. Jason wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he knew that this was the first step. It wouldn't be easy to rebuild their relationship, but at least they were talking. At least there was hope. The conversation continued, and though it wasn't easy, it felt like a beginning. Jason knew that this was just the first of many difficult steps in earning Lily's trust, but it was a start. For the first time in years, he felt like he was finally on the right path, though the road ahead was still uncertain. The days following Jason's first meeting with Lily were filled with uncertainty, both for him and for Emily. For Jason, the fear of rejection was still fresh, and he wasn't sure if he had made the right move by showing up after so many years. But something about the way Lily had looked at him, the small spark of curiosity in her eyes, gave him hope. She hadn't pushed him away, and that was more than he could have asked for. Emily, too, found herself in a strange place. She had agreed to let Jason into their lives, but that didn't mean it was easy. Seeing him interact with Lily stirred up feelings she hadn't expected. There was anger, yes, But there was also a part of her that wondered if there could be a way forward, if they could rebuild some sort of relationship, not just for the sake of their past, but for the future. Jason continued to reach out to Lily. At first, their conversations were awkward, filled with the kind of silence that only comes from years of absence. But slowly, they began to open up to each other. Jason learned about Lily's life, the things she liked, the friends she had, the way she had grown up without him. Each new detail felt like a small piece of a puzzle he had once abandoned. And with each piece, he felt both a sense of guilt and a deep desire to make things right. As Jason spent more time with Lily, he began to see the young woman she had become. She wasn't just his daughter. She was a person with her own dreams, hopes, and fears. He had missed so much, and the regret he felt was overwhelming. But he didn't let that stop him. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could be there now. He could show her, day by day, that he was ready to be the father she deserved. Meanwhile, Emily watched from the sidelines. She saw how Jason was trying, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. But it wasn't just for Lily. Emily couldn't deny the complicated feelings that still lingered between them. There was a time, years ago, when she had thought Jason was everything to her. She had loved him with a depth she had never thought possible. And though he had broken that love by leaving, there was a part of her that wondered if they could find a way back to something more than just co-parents. One afternoon, after another long conversation between Jason and Lily, Emily found herself alone with Jason in the living room. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Jason could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He hadn't expected everything to be easy, but he had hoped that things might fall into place faster. "Emily," Jason said, breaking the silence, "I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I need you to know that I'm here. For Lily, for you, whatever you need. I don't want to be a stranger in your life anymore." Emily looked at him, her heart torn. She had spent years trying to move on, trying to convince herself that she was fine without him. But now, seeing him sitting there, offering something that felt like hope, she wasn't sure what to do. "Jason, I don't know what to say," she replied softly. "It's been so long. I've had to raise Lily on my own, and I've learned how to do it without you. It's not that I don't care, but you can't just walk back into our lives like nothing happened." Jason nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for things to go back to how they were. I'm just asking for a chance to make things right, one step at a time." The conversation didn't resolve everything, but it felt like a turning point. Emily didn't know what the future would look like, and she certainly didn't know if she could ever fully forgive Jason for abandoning them. But she also knew that they couldn't keep living in the past. Her heart was still uncertain, but the door had been opened, even if just a crack. That night, as Emily tucked Lily into bed, she noticed how much her daughter had changed. The little girl she had once known was no longer there. In her place was a young woman, thoughtful and strong, who had learned to navigate life without a father. Emily could see the impact of Jason's absence in Lily's eyes, but she also saw the strength that had grown from it. And in that moment, Emily realized that no matter what happened with Jason, she had done her best. Jason's journey was far from over. He still had much to prove to both Emily and Lily, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could earn back the trust and love that he had lost. The road ahead was uncertain, and it would take time, but Jason was willing to do whatever it took. Jason knew he had a long road ahead of him. He had started to build something with Lily, and even though it wasn't easy, it felt like he was slowly making progress. But the weight of his past decisions was never far from his mind. Every time he saw Lily, he was reminded of the years he had missed, the moments he could never get back. The guilt still gnawed at him, but there was something else now too. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could become the father Lily deserved, even if it meant starting over from scratch. Lily had slowly begun to accept him back into her life, though it wasn't always easy. She still had moments of hesitation, moments where she wondered why he had left in the first place. It wasn't just the absence that hurt, it was the uncertainty that came with it. Would Jason leave again? Could she trust him to stay? These were the questions that lingered in her mind. But slowly, as time went on, she started to see a change in him. Jason was trying, and that meant something. One afternoon after school, Lily came home with something unexpected. She handed Emily a piece of paper, her face serious. "Mom, we need to talk," she said softly. Emily looked at the paper in her daughter's hand. It was an invitation to a parent-teacher meeting at school. But there was something else, something that made Emily pause. Jason's name was listed on the invitation, alongside hers. For a moment, she felt the weight of everything they had been through. She hadn't expected to have to face this so soon. But there it was, staring her in the face. Another step forward in Jason's attempt to become part of their lives again. Emily didn't know how she felt about it. She had spent so many years on her own, doing everything by herself, that the thought of including Jason again, even for something as simple as a school meeting, felt overwhelming. But she also knew that she couldn't keep holding onto the past forever. If she wanted things to work for Lily, she had to give Jason a chance. They went to the meeting together, Emily and Lily, and Jason arrived shortly after. There was an awkwardness between the three of them, but it was different from before. It wasn't the sharp, painful tension of the past. It was more like an uncertainty, like they were all trying to figure out where they stood with each other now. Jason sat beside Emily, and for the first time in a long time, they weren't just two people who shared a history. They were two people who were trying to move forward, who were trying to rebuild something together. As the meeting progressed, Jason listened closely to the teacher's feedback about Lily, taking mental notes about the things she excelled at, and the areas where she still needed support. It was the kind of meeting he had missed when he had been absent from her life. Each word, each detail, felt like a small but significant step toward making up for the years he had been gone. After the meeting, they all walked out together, and for a brief moment, it felt like they were a family again. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything, but it was progress. Jason looked at Emily, who gave him a small, almost uncertain smile. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this work. "Thanks for coming with me," Lily said quietly as they walked to the car. Jason nodded, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady. "I want to be here for you, both of you." As they drove home, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The road ahead was still unclear, but there was something different now, something that made her believe that they might just find a way forward. For the first time in a long while, she felt a small spark of hope. The future was uncertain, but at least they were taking steps toward it together. Jason still had a lot of work to do to prove that he could be the father Lily needed and the man Emily deserved. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance to make things right, even if it took time. And that thought gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The months that followed were filled with small, steady steps forward. Jason had learned that rebuilding a relationship wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't something that could be done with a few heartfelt words or gestures. It took time, patience, and consistency. But he was determined. Every day, he made an effort, whether it was helping Lily with her homework, showing up at events he had once missed, or simply being present. And little by little, he could see the walls that Lily had built around herself slowly start to come down. For Emily, the process was more complicated. She had spent so many years moving forward without Jason that the idea of fully opening herself to him again felt almost impossible. There were still moments when she felt angry or betrayed, memories of the pain he had caused her rushing back unexpectedly. But there were also moments when she saw the man he was trying to become, and those moments made her wonder if, in time, they could find a way back to each other. One evening, as they all sat around the dinner table together, something shifted. It wasn't a grand moment or a dramatic conversation. It was just the quiet comfort of shared space. Jason passed the mashed potatoes to Lily with a gentle smile, and for the first time in a long time, Emily realized that this was the life she had always hoped for. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many unresolved feelings, but there was something undeniably real about the way they were beginning to reconnect. "Thanks, Dad," Lily said as Jason handed her the dish. Jason's heart swelled at the simple words. It wasn't a confession of love or a promise of a perfect relationship, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. And it was enough. For the first time, he felt like he was truly part of their family again, and that feeling was more powerful than anything he had expected. Later that night, as Emily was putting Lily to bed, Jason sat in the living room, alone with his thoughts. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside. He reflected on everything that had happened, the decisions he had made, the consequences of his actions, and the way his life had unfolded. There had been a time when he thought he could escape his past, but now he realized that he could never truly leave it behind. All he could do was learn from it, grow from it, and be the best father in person he could be. As Emily came back into the living room, she paused for a moment at the doorway, watching him. Jason looked up and saw the look in her eyes, something that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but there was a softness in her expression that made him feel like he was no longer a stranger in her life. "I'm glad you're here," she said quietly, her voice carrying more meaning than she intended. Jason smiled, feeling the weight of those words. "Me too," he replied. "I know it's not perfect, but I'm not going anywhere." For Emily, those words were more meaningful than anything else Jason could have said. It wasn't about grand promises or sweeping gestures. It was about consistency, about showing up every day and doing the work. She had seen that in him over the past few months. She had seen the changes, the way he was making an effort to be there for Lily, to be there for her. Though the past couldn't be erased, Emily began to understand that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting that things could never be the way they once were, but that didn't mean they couldn't still be good. It meant finding a new way forward, together. As the evening wound down, Jason and Emily sat together on the couch, talking quietly about their day, about Lily, about the future. It was the kind of conversation they hadn't had in years, and in that moment, it felt like a new beginning. The road ahead was still uncertain, but there was hope, a hope that through time and patience, they could rebuild what had been broken. Jason knew that he had a long way to go before he could fully make up for the mistakes of his past. But as he looked at Emily, and then at Lily, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.